Hi, welcome back to Marriage and Family in a Global Context. This is class 7, which is about race and ethnicity. I'm really excited about this class. Now, if you haven't read pages 77 to 88, please stop the video and do that reading before we get started. Okay, I want to remind you that your first exam is next week. We have exam 1 scheduled on Canvas for June 4th, which is a Thursday. So you want to make sure that you're prepared for this. It is open book, open notes, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to actually do the work that it's going to take to earn a good grade in this class and on this exam. So let's do a rundown of the different things that you could expect based on how you've been working so far. If you've been reading and watching the videos, then you're on track to do well. You have to read and you have to watch the videos to do well because half of the exam is based on the reading, half of the exam is based on the videos. So if you're doing that, then you're on track. There's nothing extra that you need to be doing right now to prepare. Just keep doing what you're doing. Now, if you've only been doing the reading or only watching the videos, then you're almost on track to do well. You're not going to get a complete picture of the course material covered on the exam if you're just doing one or the other. But you can get on track by catching up. You've got the whole weekend ahead of you to catch up if you need to. It's not a ton of reading, it's not a ton of videos. I would recommend getting on that right now, not putting it off. There's no way that you can do all of this the day of the exam review. Now, if you've not been reading and are just downloading the slides and not actually watching the video, then you're most likely not going to do well on the exam. And if you don't get a B or an A, that's not my fault. The lecture slides are an outline of the lecture. The lecture itself is not a complete summary of the reading. When I do create the lecture, I pick out the information that I think is the most important, and then I provide you that information in the lecture, and that's what you get in the slides. But in the actual video, if you watch them, you'll notice that I give you a lot of examples and a lot more detail that's on the slide. And what I'm doing is I'm teaching you how to apply what you're learning, applying the facts that are in the slides to the actual situation. And on the exam, I'm going to be giving you examples and asking you to apply what you've learned to answer the question. So if you're kind of just thinking, well, it's open book, open notes, I'll have the book, I'll have the notes, I'll just slide by on this exam, you're going to be sadly mistaken. You have about a minute and some change to answer each question, which is not a lot of time to be flipping through notes and flipping through a book. The book and the notes you're allowed to have them because they're supposed to be an aid, not a crutch. So you have the weekend to catch up. My recommendation, if you have not been doing the reading and not been watching the videos, is to read the book. Because you're going to get a complete picture from the book. Nothing that I talk about in the lecture videos is in addition to, in most cases, in addition to the actual reading. So if you download the slides and do all of the reading, you'll be probably as well off as those who are currently in this orange category. You have the weekend to catch up. It's not too late. So at this point, you can do better, but you're going to run out of time. So if you're not prepping for the exam right now, you need to be. But if you're in the green area and you're already doing all of the work, then I wouldn't worry too much. You're going to be okay. So let's review what we learned last time in class 6. First, we learned about changes in the market, the state, and the family. So go back and think about what were those changes that occurred in those 3 different institutional arenas. If you can't remember them off the top of your head, then look at the slides for class 5 and remind yourself. This is an activity to help you remember and to not only remember in the short term, but remember in the long term the things that we're learning in class. So take advantage of this opportunity. Number 2, we looked at how individual and family factors, such as, and this is not inclusive, this is just some of the things we learned, some of the factors, like women's economic independence, the political agency of women and ethnic minorities, and household structures. These are different factors that were impacted by the changes that we saw in the market, the state, and the family. So look at these examples and think about how they were impacted. If you can't remember, go back and look at the class 6 slides so that you can remember. Then we explored how marriage and family attitudes, goals, and parenting changed. So think about different marriage attitudes and different family attitudes that change. Think about different goals that married couples and families had, and think about how people parented their children differently as a result of these changes. If you can't think of them off the top of your head, again, go back and look at class 6 and remind yourself. But if you can, if we went through all of this and you can remember all of the things that we talked about, then you're on track to do well. I don't do this Let's Review because I like to listen to myself talk. I do it because I want you to get into the habit of quizzing yourself so that you can continue to build upon what we've learned. Now, as we move into class 7, I'm going to tell you a story. And this is a story of one of my friends. And I have her permission to tell the story, but I'm not going to use her name because I want to keep her privacy private. My friend is from Guam, which is an island in the South Pacific. Now, Guam is a United States territory. A U.S. territory is like a state in that it's part of the United States, but it's not like a state, and that territories don't have representation in Congress, and people who live in territories, while they're U.S. citizens, do not have the right to vote in U.S. presidential elections, even though they're taxed. Ironic, considering why the United States declared independence from Great Britain. Anyway, that's a story for another class and another day. So my friend is Guamanian, and growing up, her race or her ethnicity would be Polynesian, and specifically Samoan. Um, Growing up, when she filled out forms, as you inevitably do pretty much anytime you do anything, she never knew which box to check on her race because the options when she was very little were like white or black or African American, um, sometimes Native American, sometimes, biracial, sometimes Asian would be on there, but there was never an island for Polynesian or Samoan or Pacific Islander. So she said, I don't know what box to check because I'm not white, I'm not black or African American, I'm not a Native American in the sense of what they're asking, and I'm not an Asian because Polynesians are not Asians. So I don't know what to check. And I'm not biracial because both of my parents are from Guam, so I don't know what to check. So she said that when she grew, as she grew up and as society became a little bit more diverse, the box options changed. And she said the first time she ever saw the word Pacific Islander on a race question, she was so overjoyed and she actually cried because she finally knew what box to check. Now, I heard this story when we both started graduate school, and I was shocked because as a white person, I've never had to question what box to check. I never even really thought about my race because I don't have to. But my friend's story highlights the importance of studying race and the importance of studying ethnicity, because for minority populations, race and ethnicity define a lot of who they are and define a lot of the experiences that they have in society, because for them, race and ethnicity matter. And we're going to be talking about why that is throughout this entire next 3 classes, but especially in this class. What we're going to do is we're going to define what race and ethnicity are, and the history of race and ethnicity, and then why we study it, why it's important. Next time, we're going to be talking about different minority groups and their experience of their race and ethnicity in American society, and how that impacted their marriages and their family. And then we'll finish up by talking about intermarriage, which is marrying people of different racial or ethnic category. It's going to be a really interesting unit, or not unit, but series of classes. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope that you are too. Now, I know that we're going to be talking about things that are complicated for us as white people. Most of the people in this class are white. There are very few people in this class who are not white. For those of you who are not white, you're probably going to understand a lot of the things we're talking about in a different way than I am and your classmates are. And so I ask you to bear with us as we work through it together. And if you have a different perspective, please email me and let me know. I'm happy to hear it and I'm happy to learn from you. But I'm also not going to put you on the spot and ask you to be a teacher about yourself, because I think that's inappropriate and puts you in a very awkward position. For the rest of you in this class who are white, I want to invite you to consider that the way that you experience and see the world is not the way that other people experience and see the world. Because as white people, we've had the benefit of legal and social privilege. We talked about the history of the American family over the last couple of classes, and what have we learned? Well, we've learned that white families evolve differently than black families and native families and Latino families and Asian families because of the experiences they had with racism. As white people, we don't experience racism because our race is not something that is ever considered and has ever been considered in our history as something that changed the way that we were treated for the worse. So as we move forward, I invite you to be open to what we're learning. I invite you to challenge the things that pop up in your mind as we're talking. If you have a negative reaction to something I say, I don't want you to just dismiss what I said as wrong. I want you to think about, why am I personally feeling bad about this? Because it may be that the reason you feel bad is subconsciously you're realizing something that you never realized before. And I know that can be really painful and a really frustrating place to be. I took an intensive course. An intensive course is one where you take the entire semester in a week. So 40 hours of content in 1 week. It was exhausting. But the course was the psychology of racism. It opened my eyes to the way the world is. And it changed me, and it was very painful. I went home and cried maybe 3 of the 5 nights of this class because it was very frustrating for me to understand new things. Now, this is going to be an even more intense experience because we're cramming all of that into 3 classes, but I'm going to take it very gentle and very slowly with you. The next class is going to be much more difficult than this one because we're actually going to be talking about racism in the next class. But I want you to know that regardless of where you are in this understanding of race and ethnicity and how it impacts your experience in this world and in this country, that I'm not judging you for where you are or what you believe. If you have questions, comments, or concerns about anything we've talked about or want to process it with me, you can. Please reach out to me and let's talk. We can set up a face-to-face meeting because I want you to understand this material, and I don't want you to feel alienated by it. I don't want you to feel like you're being called out or being made to feel bad because you're white. But what I do want you to do is understand that because you're white, you experience the world and your family experiences the world, and the marriages that you have will experience the world in a much different way than if you were Black or Latino or Asian or Native American or insert minority race or ethnicity here. Okay, so that's our agreement. There is no judgment. You are free to ask questions. And I would prefer that you ask the questions to me by email because I also want to be mindful that there are people in this class who could be negatively impacted by the questions that you have if you don't know how to ask them in a respectful way. So you don't have to worry about being respectful with me, but please email me your questions so that we can kind of keep that exchange between us and open it up to the larger community. All right, so why do we have race? Why does race exist? Well, the reason race exists is because scientists in the 18th century wanted a way to classify people. They had all of the best intentions, but it went to pot really fast. It was literally a disaster from the beginning. Not because it was bad science and not because the idea of classifying people into groups is inherently wrong, but because they had a lot of biases that they weren't aware of, and it caused them to classify people in ways that were really problematic. So the first classification of race was into 4 different groups. The Negroid group, the Proto-Australoid group, the Mongoloid group, and the Caucasoid group. And you can see from some of these words, we get some of our, some words that we have in use today, like Caucasian. That's where we get that from. Some other words that we're not going to say on the video because they're inappropriate and pejorative. The takeaway is, do not use any of these terms to describe people. Don't even use Caucasian. It's inaccurate. It's an old, outdated word. You shouldn't use it. It's not in any way an accurate way to say that someone's white or European. Just say that they're white or European. Don't say Caucasian. Um, This was the earliest classification, and basically the sociologist or anthropologist, I can't remember which, but he decided, okay, people from Africa tend to have similarly shaped skulls and facial features, so we're going to group them in this classification. People from Australia and from like Aboriginal people, not like the British immigrants to Australia, people in the South Pacific and Native Americans, they all have similar facial features and skull shapes, so we're going to call them this. And people from Asia, they all have similar skull shapes and facial features, so we're going to call them that. And then people from Arab people, people from Europe, Russia, well, Western Russia, and Europe, they all look kind of similar. They have similar skull shapes, similar facial features, so we're going to call them Caucasoids or Caucasian. So, and that comes from the word Caucasus, which is a region in modern day Turkey, and so that's where that came from. And so, that seems very scientific, and it was scientific in the sense that he was grouping people based on common features. That wasn't the problem. The problem came when other scientists tried to use these racial differences, such as skull shape or facial features, or how people existed, how people who looked like this sort of had similar cultural patterns. They tried to use this to argue that some races, specifically white people or Caucasoids, were better than others. That's where the problem started. Grouping people and separating people into groups isn't a problem until one group is given more power, privilege, and prestige than another. That's when it becomes a problem. And unfortunately, that's what happened fairly quickly. We had a lot of scientists, even today, who try to use racial differences to explain that some races are better than others. And this is a huge problem. From a genetic or biological standpoint, this is a problem because all human life emerged from Africa 50,000 to 80,000 years ago. This is something that this is a more recent discovery that science has made. We migrated from Africa and intermarried with different groups, migratory groups. Obviously, humans migrated with one another, intermarried with one another. What I'm saying is different groups from Africa migrated at different times, and they intermarried outside of their group. And so the result of that is, all these tens of thousands of years later, that the modern human genetically is really not that inherently different. In the same way that other animal species are inherently different from, subspecies are inherently different from one another. We're pretty much the same like once you strip away the external, all of our internal stuff is pretty much the same. There are some minute differences, and those differences are not attributable to the molecular level, but are attributable to the fact that different experiences that we have affects our bodies and affects our bodies in different ways. And that's the only reason. You put any creature in acid, it's going to dissolve, right? Well, if you put a human being in a toxic situation, it doesn't matter what their race is. It's going to change everything about them. Not because they're inherently different, just because that's how human beings react to stress. So if you think about that and you think about the experiences that people of color have had in the United States, as we've talked about in the history of the American family, it's understandable why we see a lot of cultural differences. Those differences aren't inherent to their race. It's just because everyone in their racial group experiences has similar negative experiences. They've evolved socially in a much different way as a result of that experience. So we're not inherently different, we're culturally different. And there's a huge distinction between that. So this is a terrible way to classify people. But that doesn't mean that race as a group is necessarily a bad thing. The grouping of people by similar characteristics isn't necessarily a bad thing. What the takeaway from this slide is, the bad thing happens when you start to put some groups start to say that some groups are better than others, and you use a categorization to discriminate and oppress people. That is the problem. And science, unfortunately, was complicit in that from the very beginning. Now, as we've just talked about, race as a social category has an undeniable history of oppression and discrimination. you can't say that all of the races are currently equal because no slavery doesn't exist anymore and because of the Equal Rights Amendment and because of the Equal Voting Act. We're all legally equal in principle, but in practice, we're not. Not because there's anything inherently different about us, but because we still have these sort of racist ideas in our head, not because we ourselves are racist, but because they've been part of our socialization and been part of our parents' socialization and grandparents' socialization. We may or may not be aware of them. That's the reality, is the awareness isn't there. When you have awareness, and the only way you get awareness is by talking about it, when you have awareness, then you move forward away from it, and then we actually will become equal, regardless of our race or ethnic group. So I'm going to give you two examples of how science and how racist science and how misusing the categorization of race has resulted in actual legal um, discrimination. And this is just a taster. We're going to be talking about a lot more specific examples in the next class, but I want to highlight what I just talked about with these two specific examples. The first is that of hypodescent, or as it's commonly called, the one-drop rule. And this is a very racist notion, and it's that having any Black or Native or Latino or Asian, that's why it's in brackets, it could change, or it doesn't matter what the culture group is, any ethnic minority applies, that having that ancestry, so having one drop of that blood, which is a stupid idea because all of our blood is the same, it doesn't look different, based on your race, that having any Black ancestry made you Black in the eyes of the law or society. So this was used before the Civil Rights Act and before the Voting Rights Act to determine if you were eligible to be a citizen or eligible to vote. So if your dad was white, and he had sexual intercourse with a Black woman who he may or may not have owned, or as I like to say, presumed to have owned. And I'm being sarcastic because you don't really have consensual sex with someone you own. Um, then that child would be Black because his or her mom was Black. If a white woman had sex with a Black man, then that child would still be Black because he had one or she had one Black parent. Um, that is hypodescent, or the one drop rule in a nutshell. That is no longer a thing. Nowadays, you can put whatever race you want on the racial categories. There's not really nobody's gonna like call you on it. Like there's not like any kind of law that says like your race is determined by anything. Um, Typically, people pick the one. White people pick white because I mean, why wouldn't you? Um, Being white still affords you a lot of social privileges these days. But most minorities pick the race that they most identify with based on their experience and the culture that they dwell in. But hypodescent is still something that is used in a legal way, and it's used for Native Americans. Your membership in your tribe or your nation is often determined by your blood quantum level. That means you have to have a certain percent of Native American descent in that specific tribe in order to be a member. And that's really important because if you're a member in that tribe, you have certain legal protections, you have certain rights of dwelling within your reservation and rights to being part of your nation and your heritage. And it also has an unintended consequence of the native people really can't marry outside of their tribe if they want to keep their citizenship in that tribe, because their children, if their blood quantum level becomes too low, then they can't remain part of their reservation or their tribe. This is actually done intentionally to get rid of reservations, um, which is why it's really problematic. Now, some nations have worked around this and they don't have that. Like, for example, the Muskogee Nation, which is the nation that originally inhabited the land where Auburn University is now. You don't have to have a certain blood quantum level. You just have to be able to trace your lineage back to the Trail of Tears. So that's a good like moving forward away from that. But hypodescent still exists in our society in that way, in that one specific way. I don't know that it exists in any other way, but if you know of some, let me know because I think it's really awful, but it's also really interesting. Um, that people still have this idea that your blood actually like makes you anything. Um, And this is a really problematic one. This is one that a lot of people don't even realize existed in our country. So eugenics is the study of how to breed, basically breed people to breed out undesirable traits. So for example, genetic modification is part of eugenics. Um, trying to get rid of certain physical traits or cognitive traits through breeding, that's eugenics in a nutshell. Now, in the 1920s until the mid 1970s, eugenics played a huge role in the lives of minority populations, specifically Black women. And they underwent something called forced sterilization, which is part of eugenics. So basically, in order to control the number of children Black women had, if they wanted to stay on, if they wanted to have access to welfare and access to government programs, they had to be sterilized. Basically, they had to have their tubes tied so that they couldn't have any more children. This is eugenics because it's attempting to control human breeding, which I know sounds awful. It makes us sound like animals, but I mean reproduction. Let's say human reproduction. um, I use the term breeding because essentially eugenics views human beings as animals that they're breeding. It's like it takes away everything, but how can we produce the specific kind of people we want? Nazi Germany, the whole idea of like exterminating the Jewish people and promoting the Aryan race, that is eugenics. Eugenics was used both in Nazi Germany and in the United States at the same time. This was a common practice. It wasn't just the Nazis doing this, but like forced sterilization of people with cognitive defects, quote unquote, people who had mental disorders, who had cognitive disorders, were forced to be sterilized so that they couldn't reproduce, so that trait would stop being prevalent in the you know among human beings. That's a problem. It wasn't just people of color who experienced it, but they experienced it at a much greater rate. Okay, so this was also a really bad thing. Like these are science. This is science that's doing this. Science is enabling the government to do this, but this is not pseudoscience. These are legit sciences, but it's a problematic application of science, and it's a problematic application of racial categorization. Okay, so what do we do? Do we just abandon race? I think for white people, it's easy to say we need to just abandon race and be colorblind, and race doesn't matter. And it's easy for us to say that, one, because we recognize the how problematic our ancestors have used race in the past. And so it's really easy to just want to distance yourself from it. It's also reasonable to want to distance yourself from it and say, okay, we know because we're white and because our race has never really mattered and never been used against us, we know that race doesn't really matter. So let's just say it doesn't matter at all. That's a really high ideal, but it's also really naive. We can't be colorblind. We can't abandon race. We have to see race for what it is. We have to recognize what happens as a result of race. And we have to then use that understanding of how different racial groups experience the world to then affect positive change. So we can't just pretend that race doesn't exist. Okay? Like, we know that only each individual person truly understands their race or ethnicity. I only understand what it means to be white. My friend Jennifer only understands what it means to be Black. You only understand what it means to be part of your racial group and your ethnicity. That is a truth that I think we can all agree on. But how other people perceive you and perceive your race or ethnicity not even may, but will determine how they treat you. So I'll give you a great example. My sister is white. My family is undeniably white. Both of my parents are white. We are white as mayonnaise, okay? Like, we are white. But we do have Native American ancestry. Our great great grandmother was Native American. Um, and as a result, in the summer, some of us in my family tan. I don't. I burn like a lobster. My sister tan. She would get pretty dark for a white person, very, very, very light for a Black person. Now she's a teacher and she teaches in an inner city Birmingham school, and everybody in her class, every one of her students is black, and it's an elementary school, so they're little kids, and they are convinced that she is mixed. That's what they call her. They said, Miss Mills, you are mixed. They think that she's biracial because she has dark skin for a white person, but lighter skin for a black person. They perceive her to be biracial. And part of that, as I explained to her, is because they respect her and they love her and they want her to be part of their culture. They are accepting her as part of their group. But that's not how she identifies, because that's not who she is. That's not the culture she grew up in. That is not the experience that she had. And she has to explain to them, like, I'm actually white and I've had a different experience than you. And like they talk about like how those experiences have been different and how it's made her life easy in some ways and hard in others, and how their life has been really hard because of their race, but how they also have some things that my sister doesn't have because their culture is different and in many ways better. Um, so it's important to realize this, and the reason we study this and the reason why it's important is because we have to understand the dissonance between these two things. That only we know who we are, but other people are going to define us the way they want to and treat us the way that they want to. And it's where these two things intersect that give us the experience, and that experience is what causes us to evolve one way or another. So studying this really matters. So we can't abandon race as a category. But what we can abandon is using it to discriminate against people. We can value the good things about race, which are how important our community is to us and the values that we share as a community and as a group. But we can also abandon the idea that our experience and our culture is the best way or the only way. So we don't abandon race. We can't say, I'm colorblind, I don't see race. But what we can say is, I see your race, I see your experiences, and some of those experiences are terrible and I hate it and I'm going to change it. And we're going to change it together. I'm not going to change it for you, but I'm going to change it with you because I want to be your friend and I want to be a partner in making life better for everybody. The end. Okay. I feel like I just preached a sermon. I'm about to cry over here. It's so emotional. Okay. So, I'm sorry, y'all. Like, my best friend is black, and I am so stressed out for her because right now is not a good time to be black, and it just makes me so mad. I look at Facebook and I look at the news, and my blood pressure goes up, and oh Lord, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing, y'all. That's why we can't be blind to it. We gotta see it, we gotta understand it, and we gotta talk about it so that we can move forward. So, moving forward, the best thing we can do is define what these two different terms mean, because race and ethnicity, while used interchangeably, are actually two very different things. So, a race or race is a group of people believed to share a common descent based on the physical characteristics. So, in other words, race is what you think somebody else is based on how they look. Okay? Now, that seems like a really shallow definition because we know that people are so different and people are so diverse and unique that the way that they look could never completely and adequately define that. I agree with that 100%. The reality is, though, that the way people look has determined their treatment forever since the beginning of time and probably well into the future. Race aside, I'm a larger woman. People judge me for that. My experience in the world is a lot different because I'm a larger woman. I have a deeper voice. Me and B. Arthur from the Golden Girls, we have a very deep voice. On the phone, people think I'm a man all the time. And it doesn't help that Darcy is kind of a gender neutral name. So the way that I look and the way that I sound determines how I get treated. It has nothing to do with who I am as a person at my most fundamental, but it determines how I get treated. So we have to remember that race, while a simple definition, is still a very impactful one. So what are some examples of race? Well, white is a race, black is a race, native is a race, Asian is a race. Pretty much any kind of classification you can think of that groups people who look and who look very similar to one another. That would be a race. So you'll notice that I've capitalized, underlined, and bolded these different words. And the reason I've done that is because this is a group, it is a name of a group, a proper name of a group, you always capitalize it. So you wouldn't say a little, like a lowercase w, white person, because that's talking about their color. If you're if you want to accurately and non-offensively talk about someone's race, you have to capitalize, and you have to capitalize the first letter. You don't have to bold or underline. I'm just doing that for emphasis. So an ethnicity then is different than a race. If a race is how other people believe, what other people believe you are based on the way that you look, an ethnicity is a group of people sharing a common cultural identity. So ethnicity, your ethnicity, is the common cultural identity that you identify with. And so common cultural identity tends to encompass things like language, religion, ancestry, and tradition. Okay, that's not an all-inclusive list, but common cultures share most of these things and some other things as well. And so your ethnicity then is a self-defined thing. Now race is still self-defined. You personally identify your racial group based on your experience. But we often, when we look at other people, we determine their race based on our own preconceived ideas about what that looks like. But ethnicity is totally individual, and it's a lot more, I think, a much better definition because it encompasses different experiences that people have and that they continue to have. So examples would be Latino or Hispanic. Now people use Latino and Hispanic interchangeably, but they're actually different. A Hispanic person is someone whose heritage can be traced back to Spain or Portugal. So that's most people in Central and South America, and Latin America, which would include parts of the Caribbean. But, let's pause that. Not everybody in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean are related to people from Spain or Portugal. Some are natives I don't know if I'm saying it right, but I'm going to say Arawak tribe, or group of people, the Carib group, Amerindians, so natives to the Caribbean islands, native groups in Central America and native groups in South America. They may not have any Spanish ancestry at all or any Portuguese ancestry at all, so they're not Hispanic, they're Latino. Now, typically you can use those interchangeably. It won't offend people, but knowing the distinction is important. All Hispanics are Latino, but not all Latinos are Hispanic. So that's just an important thing to remember. My recommendation for both race and ethnicity is always use the term the person prefers. For example, I have friends who are Black who do not like the term African American at all. Now, African American is an ethnic term because it refers to a specific cultural group in the United States. But some African Americans or some Black people do not like that term. They may use Black as both a racial and both an ethnic term. So just keep that in mind and use the term that person prefers. That is the best way to avoid offense and the best way to be an affirming person. Now, there's also this other categorization called race ethnicity. So, for example, some Latinos are also Black. Some Latinos are white. So, within an ethnic group, there may be racial differences. You probably don't know this. I think it's fascinating, but there are a ton of Irish Mexicans. The comedian Louis C.K. is from Mexico. He's Mexican. He looks Irish because he's an Irish Mexican, because some of the Irish immigrants got denied port of entry in New York, so they went to Mexico. Isn't that fascinating? He's a Latino, but he's white. But there are Latinos who are Black. That's really interesting. There are African Americans who are also Latinos. So like there is like overlap in culture. There's overlap in ethnicity. There's overlap in race. So it just goes to show that it's a much more complicated thing than we thought in the 18th century when we had 4 groups, right? So The only way we can learn about this and the only way that we know this is by asking these questions and by studying and by listening. So look at you. You're learning new things, you're studying, and you're listening. I think look at you moving forward. So that leads us to the two main reasons why we study race and ethnicity. The first is that it allows us to understand differences in marriage and family practices as a result of cultural traditions and common heritage and experience. We could look as family scientists at the way the black family is different than the white family, and we could draw conclusions on that based on our own biased notions about what it means to be white and what it means to be black. And if we did that, we would be no different than someone who creates a system of racial categorization based off of people's skulls. But if we study race and ethnicity and how those different races and different ethnicities have different cultural traditions and different heritages and different experiences, be they good or bad. If we study that, then when we look at the differences in marriage and family practices, those differences make sense to us. They make sense to us in an accurate way. It's like removing bias and looking at it from a theoretical perspective. So that's one of the main reasons why we do this, why we study this, and why it's important to study this, so that we can understand how people have gotten to be who they are based on their experiences, not because we have some kind of bias about them because of the color of their skin or where they're from. Second reason is studying race and ethnicity allow us to understand marriage and family practices in multiracial or multi-ethnic homes. So we live in a society where intermarriage is permitted and is practiced. Those families that have two different partners from two different racial experiences and two different ethnic experiences are going to look very different. They created a completely new group of people that have very different experiences that sort of mirror some cultures and not others. And that's really fascinating. I have a friend who studies this. She looks at black fathers in biracial homes and their parenting practices. It's fascinating work. Hardly anyone's doing it. So if you're interested in family science, there's an N for you. Two terms pop up when thinking about multiracial or multi-ethnic homes, and the first is endogamy, and the second is exogamy. Now, do you remember a couple lectures ago we talked about when you marry somebody who is the same sex as you, that is a homogamy, and when you marry someone who's a different sex than you, that is a homogamy. Well, this is the same idea. An endogamy is when you marry if you marry someone who's different sex or gender, then it's a heterogamy. Sorry, I got distracted. So this is the same idea. An endogamy is when you marry within your group. That could be your racial group, your ethnic group, your social class. It's not specific to race. An exogamy is marriage outside of one's group. So those are two terms to keep in mind as we move forward in our discussion. Okay, so what about white people? What do we do with white people? Well, the first term that we need to recognize is that of minority group. A minority group is a culture or a group that occupies a subordinate status in society. Okay, not because they're subordinate people or they're intrinsically less valuable, but because they've been given a less valued position in society. So all ethnic groups and racial groups that are not white are minorities. And the reason for this is historically and currently, they don't enjoy the same experience as white people. White people do make up the majority of the population. However, just the amount of people that a group makes up in a population does not determine if they're a majority or a minority. There are some notable examples of countries where the majority is actually the smallest group of people. They just have all of the wealth and power. So in determining who is a minority group and who is not, the question is what group holds the greatest percentage of wealth and power. That's how you determine which group is the majority and which group or groups are the minority. So minority groups, so people of color, tend to think of themselves in racial or ethnic terms because their experience in our society is largely determined by their race or ethnicity. So white people, we have never, ever had been discriminated against by society as a whole because of our whiteness, because we are white. We have never experienced that kind of discrimination. So our experience in society and in culture has not ever been determined by our race or ethnicity. It's not something we think about because it's not something we've ever been required to think about. But minority groups have been denied the right to vote, the right to marry, the right to stay with their families, the right to be treated as people, not property, the right to marry outside of their group, the right to access public facilities, just to name 6 things. They have been denied these things because of the color of their skin or because of their culture. So they have to think about themselves in racial and ethnic terms because that's the way that they have always been thought about and the way that they have been treated by society as a whole. But we don't, white people do not have to think in that way. But so while we don't think of ourselves in terms of racial or ethnic terms, we think of ourselves in terms of our ancestry, or as I like to say, what brand of white are we? So this is just a table from your book that gives a breakdown of white non-Hispanic Americans and where their common ancestry is. And you can see mostly European. Like an interesting percentage are Native American, but for the most part Eastern or Western European. So why does this matter? Well, the takeaway is if you get rid of all of our skin and all of our muscles and all of our organs, we all look the same. You don't look at a skeleton and instinctively say, oh, that's a white person or a black person, or a gay person, or an atheist or a religious person or a straight person. We all look the same fundamentally. But we don't experience the world in the same way. And this is a projection, this is the racial and ethnic, or the race ethnic composition of the United States from 1970 projected to 2050. And as you can see, the number of white people, the percent of white people is declining as the percent of minorities grows. And it's projected by 2050 that white people will no longer make up 50% or more of the US population. We probably still will be the majority though, because the concentration of wealth and power in white people is so high that I don't even think 30 years is going to change that. This matters because if we're going to get along as a society and we're going to move forward and we're going to make life better for everyone, not just for some, we have to understand why we are different and why we are treated different and how those differences aren't really based on anything real. They're just based on perceived biases and notions. And so in order for us to be a society that is healthy and non-toxic, we have to start considering that race and ethnicity matter, not because we're actually different, but because the way that we're perceived and treated is different. And next time, we're going to talk about some of the specific experiences of these very minority groups. So I invite you to put on your thinking hat and open your heart up because we're going to have a very interesting time next class as we talk about these things. Okay, so for your discussion for today, and I apologize that we have gone a little over. The reason we've gone over is because we talked about the exam at the beginning, which was important, and this was an important topic, but I think it was well worth it, so I appreciate you bearing with. Your discussion, there's one question this time, but it has 2 parts to it. You will get 2 points for answering this question fully, so if you only answer one part of the question, you only get 1 point. In at least 4 to 6 sentences, answer the following questions. How are race and ethnicity different from each other? That is the first part. Why is this distinction important? This is the second part. You get 1 point for this, 1 point for this. Please answer accurately, but I'm not going to grade you on accuracy. I want to see your understanding and how well you understood this based on our talk today. So answer it to the best of your ability, but don't worry about it being completely accurate. Now, this needs to be answered in a paragraph form, so your 4 to 6 sentences need to be in a paragraph, no bullet points please, and a single discussion board post. So you don't have to do separate for each part, just keep it all together for me. All right, next time, email me if you have any questions about class 7 or if you have any questions about the exam. Please answer discussion question 7 and post any questions you have about exam material in the exam discussion board. Please read pages 88 to 108 in your textbook and then watch the class 8 lecture. Have a great day, a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all bright-eyed on Monday.